I now have on the line political science professor Richard Heydarian. He's also the author of the book, Asia's New Battlefield. Professor Heydarian, good afternoon and thanks for joining us.
Hi, Carmina. Good afternoon.
All right. Can we see this any other way? Or do you think that the presence of this U.S. patrol super force, as some have been calling it, really does have something to do with a decision that's about to be made in The Hague?
Well, these dual carrier exercises by the United States have been ongoing for the past 2 years in both South China Sea or West Philippine Sea, East China and also the Philippine Sea. But of course, we can't ignore the timing of the latest exercise of the United States. I think there's 3 things to keep in mind. The first thing is we're going to have a new president soon and a new administration. So I think the U.S. is also trying to signal that they're going to be a very important security partner for us, and this will be for long. The second factor is, of course, the arbitration case. Any day the arbitration outcome could be out, and that will have huge implications for the region. Because if the arbitration says that China's claims in the area are invalid and not consistent with international law, and that China is violating the Philippines' rights to access energy resources, to resupply its people and its troops in the area, then it's really up to the United States and its allies to implement the spirit and the letter of the arbitration outcome. The arbitration outcome is binding, but it's not enforceable because the arbitral tribunal itself doesn't have the ability to enforce it, and China is going to ignore it. So it's really up to the United States, its naval muscle, and that of its allies to implement it. I think the third factor is closer to home. There are indications that China may build military facilities on the Scarborough Shoal, which is only around 120 nautical miles away from Luzon area, and that China may also impose an exclusion zone or an air defense identification zone in the Spratly chain of islands. So when you look at all these 3 factors, we are reaching a moment of truth, and I think that is why it's really up to the United States to show force, because it's the only power that can really match China's growing military footprint in the area. And I think the United States is making it clear that they're willing to play this game of chicken with China until China blinks.
All right, Professor Heydarian, let me ask you this. Will China see this exercise in the West Philippine Sea as something that's being done by the U.S. unilaterally, or will it ultimately affect how it sees the Philippines?
Oh, absolutely. I think China's position is this. And I attended the Shangri-La dialogue earlier this year when the defense officials from China and all major defense officials were there, and the Chinese delegation was very clear that what they see is that they feel that the U.S. has no place in the South China Sea dispute, that the U.S. is meddling in the disputes, and they're blaming countries like the Philippines for bringing in the United States into the dispute. So clearly, from the Chinese point of view, we are the adjoint provocateurs, and the United States is interfering in issues that is purely bilateral between China and the Philippines. But I don't think that's how other countries see it. I think majority of countries around the world, and during the Shangri-La dialogue, it was clear, defense ministers from Japan, from India, from Europe, even defense ministers from ASEAN, major countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, all of them in one way or another were very supportive of growing American military footprint in the area, because the country that they see as adjoint provocateur and their vision is China, not the United States, because the United States has had military presence and naval patrols in the South China Sea for the past 7 decades. So it's China that is a threat to the status quo, not the United States. But nonetheless, this is clearly a challenge for the Duterte administration, because if the incoming Duterte administration wants to reach out to China, it's possible that China, in exchange, may ask the Duterte administration not to further expand bilateral security relations with the United States, not to allow greater American military footprint within the Philippines areas of control and jurisdiction.
We hear you, Professor Heydarian. In fact, let's focus on that, because you and I, we've talked about this many times over, and you said that there has to be many tracks to having good relations with China. It can be bilateral talks. It can be through this arbitral tribunal. But here we have this situation in the West Philippine Sea now, and as you correctly pointed out, we're going to have a new president in the next few days. How do you think this will affect any possible bilateral talks that China might have with the Philippines in the person of President Duterte this time?
Right. As you know, personally, for the last 2 years, I've been pushing for bilateral engagement with China, because I think that no matter what kind of disputes we have, we still have to talk to them to manage the disputes and make sure they don't get out of control. But I think the devil is in the details. In principle, I think Duterte is right that we need also a bilateral track with China, which is not mutually exclusive from other multilateral and legal tracks that we have taken. But I think the timing is important. I think any bilateral talk should come after the arbitration verdict is out. I believe the arbitration case is our best leverage in dealing with China because clearly China is in a panic mode. I mean, China will always try to delegitimize arbitration proceedings and misconstrue its nature. But I think it's very clear that China is panicking. I mean, China has been gathering up to 40 countries around the world to question the validity of arbitration case. They have been lashing it out in one international forum after the other to question the validity of arbitration case. So clearly China is in a panic mode. So the Duterte administration couldn't use the arbitration verdict to extract certain concessions from China. For instance, he could say to China that, okay, I'm not going to fully leverage the arbitration case to embarrass you internationally or bilaterally. In exchange, you have to give me concessions. You have to allow our fishermen and troops to have better access across our exclusive economic zone and do not build military facilities in the Scarborough Shoal. So I think gives a lot of leverage to the Duterte administration, and that's why it's important for us not to drop the case as China has been asking us to do. And I hope the verdict will be positive enough so that the Duterte administration will be able to extract enough concession in exchange. So I think this is where the devil is in the details. But nonetheless, arbitration is something that could help us in moving ahead. Because what's the point of having bilateral talks if you have no leverage whatsoever? So I think that's the caveat that you have. You go and talk to China, but you make sure that you also have a leverage to make sure that you can also ask concessions in exchange from China. But it's important that Duterte will not be naive about China and will not give in too much concessions also in exchange for any prospective Chinese concessions within our exclusive economic zone.
All right, Professor Richard Heydarian, political science professor and also author of the book Asia's New Battlefield. We appreciate you joining us this afternoon. Thanks again for taking our call.